Brace yourself for a countdown of the world's 10 most brutal prisons, where conditions are so horrific, death seems like a better option. These places are symbols of unimaginable cruelty. Let's dive into the nightmare. Eagle Discovery. The Bottle Dungeon, medieval torture at its worst. Imagine being thrown into a dark, cold pit, where you're forced to crouch in a cramped space with no way to stand or lie down. This was the terrifying reality of the Bottle Dungeon, a medieval torture device used across Europe, especially in castles in England and France. The dungeon got its name from the French word bottle, meaning forgotten. Once a prisoner was thrown in, they were abandoned and left to fade into obscurity. The dungeon's narrow, funnel-like shape trapped victims in a hunched position, causing immense physical pain. With no room to stretch or move, the body would stiffen, muscles would cramp, and circulation would suffer. Over time, this extreme immobility could lead to long-term health issues, even death. Prisoners endured not only physical suffering, but also psychological torment. The dungeon was pitch black, with no light or sound except the occasional flicker of light from above or the distant echo of footsteps. The isolation was absolute. No one would know they were there, and no one would come for them. This abandonment, the feeling of being forgotten by the world, was often more torturous than any physical punishment. Survivors of the Bottle Dungeon were few. Those who managed to endure often suffered permanent mental scars, struggling with depression, madness, and a loss of hope. Some remained in these hellish conditions for months or even years, and many never made it out alive. Though the Bottle Dungeon is no longer in use, its legacy remains as one of the darkest examples of medieval cruelty, a horrifying reminder of the inhumane punishments that once existed in the name of justice. The Gallows, a public spectacle of suffering. In 18th century England, hanging wasn't just a method of execution, it was a public spectacle, designed to instill fear and maintain order. The gallows were infamous for their brutal and gruesome displays, where condemned criminals were not immediately executed, but instead placed in cages and left hanging in the air for days, weeks, or even months. They would suffer a slow, agonizing death, often from dehydration, starvation, or exposure to the elements. These gallows were more than just instruments of punishment. They were powerful symbols of authority. Authorities used them to send a message to the public. Crime would not be tolerated. The spectacle was meant to publicly humiliate the criminal and strike fear into anyone who might consider breaking the law. For many, the suffering of the accused was a chilling reminder of the power held by those in control. During this time, the condemned were often exposed to the harshest weather. Whether it was the scorching heat of summer or the bitter cold of winter, the prisoners would hang helplessly, enduring the elements without any mercy. Some would even beg for death, unable to bear the torment of their slow demise. The suffering wasn't limited to the prisoners alone. The surrounding communities were forced to witness the decaying bodies hanging in public. The smell of rotting flesh filled the air, and the gruesome sight became an everyday part of life for locals. The bodies, left to decay in full view, were a constant reminder of the harsh justice system in place at the time. The gallows were designed to serve as both punishment and deterrent, but their legacy endures as a horrifying example of the cruelty and public humiliation used to maintain control in 18th century England. El Salvador's prison hell, a fight for survival. In El Salvador, there's a place so horrific that it feels closer to hell than any modern prison. After a violent civil war, the country found itself grappling with brutal gang violence. To tackle this crisis, President Nayib Bukele's government launched an extreme crackdown, locking up more than 70,000 gang members in overcrowded prisons, a move that shocked the world and raised serious human rights concerns. Imagine being crammed into a tiny, filthy cell with over 100 other violent gang members, each one covered in tattoos that tell the story of their brutal lives. There are no mattresses, no blankets, just cold, uncomfortable metal beds. The lights never go off, casting a constant harsh glow on your cell, making it impossible to sleep in peace. On top of that, the prison is under 24/7 surveillance, with cameras watching every move, turning the place into a never-ending nightmare of fear and control. The conditions in these prisons are unbearable. Food and water are scarce, and there's almost no access to hygiene or medical care. Privacy doesn't exist, and the constant tension among the overcrowded prisoners makes every moment feel like a fight for survival. Every day is a battle to stay alive, to avoid being caught in the violent clashes that erupt between rival gangs or between prisoners and guards. Despite the international outcry over the inhumane conditions and human rights violations, the crackdown has led to a dramatic drop in violent crime in the country, by more than 50%. This raises a difficult question. Is this brutal form of justice and the peace it brings worth the horrific price paid by those who live through it? The situation in El Salvador's prisons continues to divide opinion, with some seeing it as a necessary evil and others as a violation of basic human dignity. The Coffin Prison, a tiny, suffocating trap. The Coffin Prison is not a traditional cell but a brutal form of confinement that forces the prisoner into an excruciating, suffocating trap. The prisoner is placed inside a wooden box or stone cave, so small that there's no room to stand, lie down, or move in any way. This method of torture dates back to ancient Roman times, where victims were sometimes sealed inside tight spaces and left to suffer in complete isolation. The confined space was so restrictive that the body had no choice but to remain in a contorted, fetal-like position, unable to stretch or shift, making it one of the most painful and unbearable forms of imprisonment. The agony of confinement in a coffin prison is amplified by the darkness and lack of ventilation. Often these small spaces were completely sealed, plunging the prisoner into total blackness with no light to mark the passing of time. The air inside would quickly become stuffy and hard to breathe, and the prisoner would slowly suffocate, gasping for each breath as the oxygen was depleted. Over time, the heat from the body and the lack of airflow would make the air stiflingly hot, creating an atmosphere where each second felt like an eternity. Food and water were provided in minimal amounts, often just enough to keep the prisoner alive, but not enough to sustain them over a prolonged period. Without adequate sustenance, the prisoner would slowly become weaker, dehydrated, and starving. The lack of nourishment combined with the constant struggle to breathe created a nightmarish existence. The prisoner's physical body would deteriorate, but the psychological toll was just as brutal. Trapped in such a confined space with no interaction, no human contact, and no way to measure time, many prisoners were driven to madness or despair. They were left alone with their thoughts, their fear, and the suffocating realization that they had no way out. Though the coffin prison is no longer commonly used, similar forms of extreme confinement still exist in some parts of the world. In these places, authorities justify such cruel methods of punishment as a means of control or retribution, often neglecting basic human rights in favor of maintaining power. This continued use of extreme solitary confinement serves as a stark reminder of the dark history of torture and the ongoing need for global human rights advocacy. The coffin prison, with its suffocating silence and isolation, is a chilling example of how far some societies have gone in their pursuit of punishment, and a reminder that such cruelty must never be forgotten. The Clink Prison, a symbol of power and oppression. In Southwark, London, the infamous Clink Prison stood as a chilling reminder of the abuse of power for nearly 7 centuries, operating from the 12th century until 1780. The Clink was not merely a place of incarceration, it was a symbol of religious and political oppression, where dissenters were punished and humiliated under the guise of law and order. The prison's reputation for brutality became so notorious that the word clink eventually came to symbolize any prison or jail in general. The Clink's history is deeply tied to the turbulent religious landscape of England. During times of political and religious strife, many of those thrown into its dank, cold cells were religious dissenters, those who opposed the state-sponsored church, or anyone who was considered a threat to the ruling authority. These individuals were often imprisoned without trial, subjected to torture and forced confessions in order to suppress their beliefs and silences their voices. The Iron Maiden, a medieval nightmare. The Iron Maiden might sound like something out of a gruesome myth, but in reality, it was one of the most terrifying and brutal forms of torture used during the Middle Ages. This iron contraption was designed to resemble a human figure, standing upright, but it wasn't built for display. It was built for pain. Inside the Maiden, the walls were lined with sharp, jagged metal spikes, designed to impale anyone unlucky enough to be locked inside. The victim would be forced into the Iron Maiden, and as the door slowly closed, the spikes would puncture the body in numerous places, across the chest, face, abdomen, and limbs. The spikes were strategically placed to cause maximum agony, piercing deep into the flesh but avoiding vital organs, ensuring that the person would remain alive to endure the pain for as long as possible. With each inch the door closed, the pain would intensify as the spikes gradually pierced through the skin and into the body, causing bleeding, shock, and unimaginable suffering. This torture was not meant to kill immediately, but rather to prolong the victim's agony. The spikes were carefully placed to inflict torment without causing instant death, creating a slow, agonizing demise. The process could take hours or even days, as the victim bled out or succumbed to the shock and trauma of the injuries. While the existence of the Iron Maiden has been debated by historians, with some suggesting it was more of a medieval invention or exaggeration, it remains a chilling symbol of the cruelty and violence that marked the Middle Ages. Whether it was used frequently or not, the legend of the Iron Maiden has endured, symbolizing the extreme brutality of the time and the dehumanizing torture methods employed to punish those who were perceived as enemies or criminals. The Iron Maiden serves as a reminder of the terrifying capacity for cruelty in human history. It embodies the fear and violence that pervaded the Dark Ages, a period when torture was not just a means of punishment, but also a way to instill terror and control. Even today, the mere thought of the Iron Maiden is enough to send chills down the spine, making it one of the most infamous and terrifying instruments of medieval torture. The Fortress of the Prison Island of Despair. Located off the coast of Marseille, France, the Fortress of If was originally designed as a military defense structure, built in the 16th century to protect the city from naval attacks. However, over time, it became infamous not for its strategic importance, but as a brutal prison, one that housed political dissidents, religious prisoners, and anyone deemed a threat to the ruling authority. The island became a symbol of hopelessness, a place where human suffering and isolation took on a new level of despair. One of the darkest chapters in the fortress's history is its role in the persecution of the Huguenots, the French Protestants who faced brutal repression for their faith. More than 3,500 Huguenots were imprisoned in the fortress, condemned to live out their final days in grim isolation. These prisoners were often subjected to harsh conditions, overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate food. The cold, damp stone walls of the fortress seemed to amplify the suffering, trapping the prisoners in a world of darkness and deprivation. Many died in captivity from disease, starvation, or the sheer mental toll of living in such a hopeless place. The Fortress of If became a place where hope went to die. Prisoners were kept in solitary confinement in small, windowless cells, cut off from the world outside. The constant isolation, the never-ending silence, and the inability to see daylight for long periods of time drove many to madness. The oppressive atmosphere of the fortress was a silent killer, robbing those who were locked inside of any chance for redemption or escape. Though it was originally intended as a defensive fort, the fortress of If soon became infamous as a prison of suffering, where people were held not for their crimes, but for their beliefs or their challenge to authority. It is said that the fortress's very isolation from the rest of the world contributed to its role as a place of psychological torment. There was no hope of escape, no chance of rescue. Prisoners were left to die in despair. Today, the Fortress of If stands as a tourist attraction, its dark history preserved in its stone walls. It is perhaps best known as the setting for Alexandre Dumas' novel The Count of Monte Cristo, where the protagonist, Edmond Dantès, is wrongfully imprisoned in the fortress. While the story of Dante is fictional, it echoes the real-life suffering that occurred within the fortress's walls, where real men and women were condemned to live out their final days in a prison that symbolized nothing less than hopelessness and despair. The Fortress of If serves as a haunting reminder of the brutality of political and religious persecution and the lengths to which authorities will go to silence dissent. It stands as a testament to the human capacity for cruelty and the devastating effects of being stripped of your freedom and humanity. From the medieval dungeons to the brutal modern prisons, these places show just how far human cruelty can go. But they also raise an important question. How far is too far when it comes to punishment? Should humanity strive for better ways to correct wrongdoers? Or is it the duty of society to protect itself by any means necessary? What do you think? Do these prisons make you reflect on the darker side of justice? Or do you feel they are necessary to maintain order? Let's continue the discussion in the comments below.